Welcome back to Searchlight Report, a podcast from South Dakota Searchlight that brings you up to date on policy and politics in the Mount Rushmore state. I'm your host, Megan O'Brien. Last week's primary election included 4 candidates for the Republican nomination for governor. The winner in that race needed 35% of the vote, which none reached on Tuesday night. That means the top 2 candidates, current Governor Larry Rhoden and businessman Toby Doeden, will campaign for 8 more weeks until a special election on July 28th. The winner will face Democrat Dan Ahlers in the November general election. Though Doeden didn't get enough support to win outright, he ended the night in first place at 31%. Rhoden finished second with 25%. The other 2 candidates were U.S. Representative Dusty Johnson, who was third with 23%, and State Speaker of the House John Hanson with 21%. Republican political commentator Pat Powers, who has written for the South Dakota War College blog for more than 20 years, joined me for an interview about the primary and the runoff. The narrow margins stood out to him, especially compared to races for nominations to run for U.S. Senate and House.
The thing that strikes me is that if you look at the numbers, it was really a narrow band. The low vote was Hanson at 21%, and the high vote was Doeden at 31%. I mean, that's between the two. That's only represented a difference of 13,000 votes, where the other 2 fell in there. You compare that to the one-on-one races of Marty Jackley and Mike Rounds, where, the difference between they and their opponents are 70,000 votes. They won with 79 and 76% of the vote. So no one really broke from the pack, so to speak, in the governor's race. So, it was kind of a mad scramble to see who could put the most votes together. And, it ended up as it did. You can't really say that anybody lost badly, because there's not that much difference between Larry Rhoden, Dusty Johnson, or John Hanson. They're all in that 20% range.
Yeah, were you expecting to see Doeden's numbers get that high?
Well, I don't know that anybody did, because he's a new quantity in the he's new and really has no experience running before. But I think the fatal error in the race was that everybody underestimated his performance, and they never really went after him with any criticism. And if you think about it in that way, it's a lot like the what people talk about in comparison, the Rounds Kirby Barnett race for governor, where Kirby and Barnett went after each other, but they left Mike alone. And then on election day, Mike took the win. And so with Toby Doeden, just like Mike Rounds, the attacks didn't happen to Toby, so he kind of benefited from the hall pass. And I know some of the strategy out there for some of the candidates is they kind of thought Toby was the person they wanted to be in the runoff against. So you didn't see any commercials poking at him while everybody else was busy going after each other. And Doeden took his shots. He leveled attacks at them. The jailhouse John Hanson week on crime attack that came out of Toby Doeden's camp. And he had other attacks on Dusty and Larry Rhoden. Dusty had outside groups coming in, and he was kind of stung by votes he's managed to get a pass on from voters before, such as his vote for the January 6th investigation and a vote to reject what was a kind of an atypical funding mechanism for the border wall. It was just kind of outside what was normally done, and they didn't think it was necessarily constitutional. So, he rejected that funding, but voted for it every other time. Now, keep in mind, since these things he was getting hit with, Trump had endorsed Dusty for Congress since those votes. So obviously there was no problem with it, but the outside group, they use those to great effect to drive Dusty's numbers down. And so everybody is out there being defined. The hits against Rhoden, the hits against John Hanson, the hits against Dusty, they were being defined. So, and at the same time, nobody was defining Toby. So he had complete autonomy to define himself. And, his commercials were effective in doing so. I mean, they might have been very practice and rote, and the commercials didn't deviate from any other speech he's given, but, he got them to sink in, and nobody was taking the bark off him. So you've got a situation where he's got full autonomy, and it showed. I mean, he won.
And so now this becomes a contest between Rhoden, who is kind of an established political figure in South Dakota now, and Toby Doeden, who hasn't been elected to office. When I spoke with Rhoden after his watch party, he had mentioned that this kind of gives him that clear contrast to kind of have between him and Doeden. I'm curious, I guess, what you think about that comment.
Well, I think, I mean, if you look at it, I'm looking at it that where they fell in the spectrum, you had 69% of voters voted against Toby. 75% of voters voted against Larry. Now they've got to come bring those others back and try to put together winning numbers. Many of the traditional Republican financial backers who'd backed like Dusty's campaign and some of the Hanson ones as well, they're going to shift over naturally to Larry, but money has not been a barrier for Toby Doeden. He can just write a check. So, it's going to be whoever can run the most effective campaign. Right. And so you've got 45% of supporters out there who are of the other candidates who are in the wind. And I find it interesting that the two campaigns who had a much more effective ground game than Governor Rhoden or Toby Doeden, those are the campaigns that lost. And so their supporters are adrift. And that ground game element is kind of what the Rhoden and the Doeden teams need to capture, because you've got a few signs out there for Larry. Toby relied primarily on TV. I mean, driving across the state, you don't really see much for Toby Doeden signs anywhere. And so that ground game is what both of them lack, and that both of them kind of need to capture.
With that too, then, what do you think didn't work out of Hanson's and Johnson's campaigns?
Well, I don't know that it was something that didn't work. I think it was just, as I said, there were a lot of negative attacks on them. There were attacks from them, and what didn't work was, the attacks against them were a little more effective. I don't know that, if anything, it was maybe just a miscalculation of resources of maybe they should have been going after Toby Doeden when they didn't. Again, if nobody's going after the candidate who eventually wins, maybe he should have been the one you were going after in the first place.
And so when we're looking back on the campaigns and even back to the legislative session, property taxes and sales tax and all that good stuff was quite the conversation. It was really what was brought up throughout these debates. It's been kind of that factor. How big of a factor do you think it was throughout these campaigns?
Well, I mean, that was the big topic of discussion, property taxes. You had Toby is out there claiming he's going to get rid of all property taxes, which, good luck with that. I don't like paying them either, but what are you going to replace it with? Larry And again, as the commercial said, Larry and John Hanson worked on a plan to replace some of the property taxes with new sales taxes, and they certainly took a hit for it, because you can flavor it any way you want. It's a tax shift, and the only way you get it is with new taxes. And that I don't think helped them. But here we are, and this will be an argument that the candidates will be having with each other for the next 8 weeks.
And you've mentioned too, as this runoff kind of goes on, Doeden can kind of write a check for whatever he needs. How do you think that campaign finances played into this?
Oh, I think campaign finance was a part of it, but obviously, Dusty had as much money as he needed at his disposal from a significant war chest. I think it came to the point where you could spend anything, but it's hard to put the airtime together. It gets hard to break through. We are in a position where we get so many ad impressions at a time. What point does it just become noise?
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, campaign finances are going to probably be a factor in the runoff, but I think a lot of the people who had donated to Dusty and maybe even to some degree to John Hanson, they're going to back Larry. I mean, Doeden isn't out there doing a lot of fundraising or any fundraising, so he's obviously not worried about that. He was on the air as much as anybody. And I mean, a campaign is about building name ID. I always, when I talk to candidates and I advise candidates, I talk about the know, like, trust test. And most candidates don't get past the know part. And the know part is just pure name ID. And, Toby has obviously gotten his name out there enough where he got 31% of Republican voters to vote for him. So they felt they knew who he was and what he stood for.
And we also saw all four of these candidates try to align themselves with Trump in one way or another. Do you think that played a role in who got which votes?
I don't know that it did. That's just kind of the space that everybody in the Republican Party is operating in at this point. Nobody is out there running as the anti-Trump candidate, because Trump is very popular in South Dakota. I mean, he does very well here. He polls well here. In the Republican primary, that's being the anti-Trump candidate is not somebody you want to be. And that's one thing they tried to paint Dusty with, and that did not help his case.
And so then, as we're going forward, especially with Dusty Johnson, I mean, he's had experience working with former Governor Dennis Daugaard. He's served on the Public Utilities Commission. He's been in Congress for 8 years now, or coming up on 8 years. What do you think his legacy is?
Dusty's legacy has always been about good governance. He will admit he's a policy wonk, and finding solutions to problems has been something he has worked on from day one of his political career and continues to do to this day in Congress. There's lots of problems out there to solve, and Dusty is less about the rhetoric and more about finding a solution.
What do you think is next for him?
I think the world is his oyster right now. I've never seen anyone who is poorer from the experience. I mean, I think Dusty can do anything he wants. If you're talking in terms of political races, politics and running is all about it's about timing and what, timing and opportunity, and maybe there will be an opportunity here in the future, whether it's now or 2 years or 4 years from now. uh, are we going to find ourselves looking for a problem solver, or is Dusty going to want to go back into the private sector? I don't know, and I think he hasn't figured that out yet. So there's, I think give him a little time. He'll find something to do.
And so, as we're kind of going into this runoff, do you anticipate Hansen's and Johnson's supporters going one way or another? Do you see them kind of splitting off? What are you envisioning for that?
Well, and it's interesting. Both of those teams they're just up for grabs. On election night, Toby was claiming, well, Dusty's people are going to him and he's going to be talking with them in the morning. Well, I talked to Dusty's people in the morning and they kind of laughed at that, said, no, I haven't heard anything from Toby yet. So, and then you also have Hansen's people who, if you watched any of the online chatter on Facebook, they were literally at war with Toby's people online. And so, and you haven't seen John Hansen give them any direction. But by the same token, nobody's really jumping right away over to Larry immediately either. I mean, I think it's going to take a little time and outreach. I think at least some of those in the Sioux Falls area are more interested in working on that mayoral runoff at the moment, as opposed to jumping right back into the gubernatorial campaign. And we'll probably know more, I would say, by the Republican convention, because that mayoral runoff in Sioux Falls is the Tuesday before the Republican convention. So by convention, we'll kind of know what a lot of those people are doing and what they're interested in. And I think that'll be kind of more of the touch point. And that's kind of halfway to the 8-week runoff. I think for Larry and for Toby, right now, they're probably their biggest task is putting in the framework to seal the deal and trying to figure out, okay, I've got to put together a statewide campaign, which, they've already got, but, they're missing that ground game element. So they need to figure out a way to put together an army of supporters and organize them and send them out to spread the message for the people who didn't go with them from the TV commercials or text messages.
And what topics do you anticipate kind of becoming the focus of this runoff?
Oh, I suspect that just like the primary election, they'll probably focus on property taxes. Larry will say he solved it, and Toby will say we need to get rid of them. And they'll maybe get into a little more semantics from there. And they'll probably talk about cuts and things like that. But I think property taxes will continue to be the focus.
Advanced voting for the Republican runoff is underway. Voter registration is open through July 13th, and the special election is July 28th. To learn more about Doeden and Rhoden, check out our interviews with each of them in prior episodes.
Hi, I'm Seth Tupper, editor at South Dakota Searchlight. If you want to know more about what questions will be on the ballot or keep up with the candidates for state and federal elections, we've got the coverage you'll need this election season. Our reach goes from East River to West River with journalists in Sioux Falls, Pierre, and Rapid City. You can check out our election coverage on our website, southdakotasearchlight.com, and subscribe to our free newsletter at southdakotasearchlight.com/subscribe.
That's all we have for this episode of Searchlight Report. Audio for this episode of the podcast came from recordings by South Dakota Searchlight. The podcast is based on reporting by South Dakota Searchlight's staff, editor Seth Tupper, senior reporter John Holt, and reporters Joshua Heyer, Mackenzie Huber, and me. I write the scripts and produce the audio with editing by Seth Tupper. South Dakota Searchlight is part of States Newsroom, the nation's largest nonprofit news organization. Until next time, I'm South Dakota Searchlight's Megan O'Brien with the Searchlight Report.